Welcome to the 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar series. The goal of NCFCA webinars is to facilitate a platform where thought leaders and subject matter experts can provide insight on topics relevant to current debate resolutions and speech events. Our desire is to provide a platform that encourages mentorship, real-life application, and competitive excellence. Our intention for this webinar is to help provide educational context for the debate topic from our guest speaker's specific area of expertise. Please keep this framework in mind as you craft your questions and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to interact with someone who can provide subject matter expertise regarding the debate topic of fair trade and free trade. The format for this evening's webinar will begin with a 30-minute presentation from our guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Larson, and will be followed by a giveaway hosted by our sponsor, the University of Northwestern. Please participate in this evening's webinar by using the Q&A function, as we will be selecting one individual based on engagement to receive a free sweatshirt during the giveaway. We will also select 2 individuals at random to receive a free t-shirt. Both of these prizes will be provided by the University of Northwestern. Following the giveaway, we will move into a 15-minute live Q&A with Dr. Larson and Dr. Ravi Paul. And during this time, we will respond to questions you have submitted throughout the presentation. So again, please submit questions via the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to submit requests for help via the chat function. Our NCFCA webinar tech support team is on the back end, and we're ready to help in any way that we can. And at this point, it's my honor to invite Dr. Ravi Paul to join us on screen as I introduce him to all of you this evening. Dr. Paul is an Associate Professor of Management Information Systems in the College of Business at East Carolina University. He earned both his master's and PhD in Industrial Management from Clemson University after completing his Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Bangalore University. Dr. Paul is also an NCFCA parent, debate coach, and a member of our NCFCA debate committee, and we're thrilled to have him here this evening. And so, Dr. Paul, if you'd like to join us on screen, we'll have you introduce Dr. Larson.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. It says, okay, there you go. There we go.
There we go.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Natalia. Welcome, everybody. It's great to kick off this year with this wonderful webinar. Thanks to Natalia and her team for all the work that's gone beforehand in getting to this point. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. It's our pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Andrew Larson from the University of Northwestern. Dr. Larson is an economist with a doctoral degree in applied economics from the University of Minnesota with an emphasis in trade and development. Dr. Larson also has experience working in the fields of finance and accounting, which has helped him to understand the production side of business. In the 1990s, Dr. Larson worked for World Relief in Burkina Faso, Africa, where he observed firsthand issues relating to free and fair trade. Over the last few years, he has taught undergraduate courses in macro and microeconomics, where trade policy issues have arisen. Welcome, Dr. Larson, and you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts on the debate topic of at hand in your resolution. The resolution for this year's debate topic reads as follows: when in conflict, governments should value fair trade above free trade. This is a very interesting question that requires us to examine the ideas of economics and trade to help us to understand the context for the debate. I'd like to address 4 different areas in my talk this evening. First of all, I'd like to give you a historical background of the development of trade and economic theory over the last 3 centuries or so. Then followed by that, we'll go ahead and talk about some different types of economic systems that are operating in the world today. And followed with that, we'll explore some microeconomic theory that applies to our question of free trade versus fair trade. And then lastly, we'll dive into, with more detail, into the subject of fair trade. So let's get started. The historical background, I'm going to take you all the way back to the scripture. And we see that in Genesis, God created the world endowed with resources. These resources we economists call land. And in addition, of course, God created mankind to manage his creation. And so in the very beginning, all there was in terms of economic factors was land and labor. There was no capital equipment yet at that time. And it was up to mankind to go ahead and develop capital equipment and capital factors of production only from labor and land. This is important because it illustrates the importance of our stages of production in taking a raw commodity, like something out of the earth, and transforming it into something more highly advanced. In the New Testament, Jesus quoted the law and said that the greatest commandment is that we love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So in our relations with other people, including commercial relations, we have the goal of glorifying God in all that we do, and also loving other people as we love ourselves. Paul told the Philippians in the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verse 4, that we should look not only to our own interests, but also to the interests of others. And so that requires that we do pay attention to the welfare of other people around us. And again, that does apply in our commercial relations with people near and far, whether at the local grocery store or across the world in another continent. Now, jumping ahead a few centuries, we come to Adam Smith. In 1776, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which discussed the idea of how people, out of their own self-interest, can enhance the social good of their economy or their society. And it's as if each person, as they were pursuing their own interest in providing some service or some good to another person, in a decentralized framework with nobody giving them directions, all of these people operating individually had the effect of actually providing in a very efficient and cost minimizing way goods and services that people were desiring to consume. And Smith called this, excuse me, please. Smith called this the invisible hand. The invisible hand is a story of how it's as if somebody was orchestrating all of these operations and relationships of commerce across all these individual laborers and firms in an effort to go ahead and create something of value that was useful to society. This was the beginning of what we call free markets and free enterprise, or otherwise known as capitalism. And after Adam Smith, a few years later, there was another economist named David Ricardo. And in the 1806 or so, he wrote a book comparing what we call absolute advantage with comparative advantage. And up to that time, excuse me, please. Up to that time, people believed that whichever country had the greatest cost advantage should go ahead and produce that good, and that was called absolute advantage. And that made sense. Whoever could produce something the most inexpensively should be the one to produce it. But Ricardo said it's not absolute prices that we are interested in. Rather, it is relative prices reflected in what we call opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the cost of the next best opportunity that is available to you. And he called this comparative advantage. So comparative advantage says that if I have a lower opportunity cost, then I should go ahead and produce this good. For instance, here in Minnesota, it snows, and so I could go ahead and shovel the sidewalk, or I could have my children shovel the sidewalk. Now, comparative advantage says that whoever has the lower opportunity cost should do that task. So therefore, if I shovel the sidewalk, that's going to take time away from my schedule, and my time is relatively more valuable than my children's time. I could use that time in my professional work and be more productive that way. My children, on the other hand, they don't have such a productive alternative available to them. If they don't shovel the walk, well, then they would just play in the snow and have a lot of fun. Their opportunity cost of shoveling is lower than my opportunity cost. Therefore, they should be the ones shoveling the sidewalk, even though I probably have an absolute advantage in shoveling and could do that better than they could. Now, that was a very important concept to bring to the subject of international trade, and it remains in the forefront even today. Brought to you by David Ricardo. Now, later in the 1870s, a group of 3 economists independently arrived at another important topic having to do with subjective value. Carl Munger from Austria and William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras all discovered the relationship of marginal utility. That is to say that as we consume things, we realize satisfaction for each unit of consumption. Now, that is related to subjective value. This became known as the marginal revolution, something very important and revolutionary to economic thinking. So the value of goods is actually determined by subjective value, and not by the cost of the labor resources or the inputs into that good. Up to that time, people believed that the value of a good was determined by the cost of inputs. So if I spent 100 hours painting a painting, well, then I could say that that painting would be worth so much money according to the value of my hours. But if nobody desires my painting, then the true value is really zero. So value is subjective in the eyes of the consumer, according to the marginal thinking. And this plays a very important role when we come to fair trade and free trade. Also, as we consume more of something, there's a diminishing to this marginal utility or satisfaction. We indeed lose satisfaction as we consume more of a good. Now, I'd like to move on to our next area and talk about economic systems currently operating in the world. We touched on free enterprise and free markets with Adam Smith. We'll come back to that here in a moment. But back at that time, there was a popular belief called mercantilism. Mercantile countries had a desire to improve their welfare and their wealth by maximizing exports and minimizing imports. So the large colonial powers practiced mercantilism. England, France, and Spain, they all practiced this theory of trying to produce everything they needed with minimal inputs from the outside. And that was the keystone to their colonial policies. Now, beyond that, though, we moved away from mercantilism for the most part, and now we have two major systems before us. The other system that you see across the world is called socialism. Socialism is where there is a central authority, usually the government, that is in charge of an economy. And the economy is in fact planned from that central authority. So what to produce, what to consume, how much to charge, who's to work where, and where we get resources. All of these details in the economy are decided in a centrally planned economy under socialism. So the key is that under socialism, the factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability are owned and governed and directed by the state. Now, in contrast to socialism is the framework that came out of Adam Smith's thinking, which we call free markets and free enterprise, or otherwise known as capitalism. And under free markets, this refers to the consumption side of the economy. Under free markets, I have the freedom to consume goods and services as I wish, as I desire, if I am able and willing to pay the price. That is free trade. Now, free enterprise, on the other hand, refers to the production side of the economy. And in this case, it refers to the freedom of enterprises and firms to decide what to produce and where to produce and how to produce and so on, as long as the effort is private and voluntary, and as long as parties are not infringing on the property rights and human rights of other people in society. So we have now this understanding of free trade and free enterprise to bring to our microeconomic analysis. So let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into the microeconomics of this question of free trade and fair trade. Well, microeconomic theory tells us that price is determined by the intersection of supply and demand. And at that price, we observe that all the quantities of supply that sellers and suppliers are willing to sell are exactly matched up with the quantities that consumers are willing and able to buy at that equilibrium price. That is a market clearing price that actually clears the market so that there is no surplus and no shortage of the good in question. And at this point, we see that the marginal benefit of the last good of consumption is equal to the marginal cost of the last good produced. Therefore, we have more benefit accruing to society through equilibrium than we otherwise would be. That's why everybody loves a good trade. Each party, both parties, will walk away believing and realizing that they indeed received something more than they gave up. Now, at this point, equilibrium price, that demand is equal to supply. Now, I mentioned this benefit that accrues to society. This benefit is divided now between what we call a consumer surplus and producer surplus. This is important for our analysis as we look at fair trade and free trade. Consumer surplus refers to the difference between a consumer's marginal utility or marginal satisfaction they receive from the consumption of a unit of a good, less the price they actually pay. So if you go to a restaurant and you order a pizza, you may pay $12 for the pizza. And you may have been thinking, you know, I am really hungry, I am starving, I'd love to get a pizza. I'd be willing to pay $16 for a pizza. Well, here you go to the restaurant and you only have to pay $12. That is a great deal. And so you have realized a consumer surplus by only having to pay $12 for the pizza. So your surplus then is a difference, 16 less 12, or $4 consumer surplus. Now, from the point of view of the producer, that restaurant, the producer receives the $12 in revenue, and let's say the cost of that pizza is only $7. So in this case, the producer's surplus is the price less the cost of production, which would be $5. So the producer also gains a surplus of that $5. And altogether then, both the consumer and the producer have a total surplus of $12. So under free markets, then that surplus is divided up between consumers and producers according to the position of the equilibrium price. Also, on the production side, I want to mention another concept which will come in very handy, and that is the concept of marginal revenue product, the marginal revenue product of labor. This has to do with the contribution of one additional worker or one additional hour to the production operation. Let's say you work at a restaurant and your boss hires another worker. Well, that marginal revenue product of that additional worker will be the value added by that worker's contribution to the business. And so the owner of the restaurant would be happy to pay that worker up to the marginal revenue product of the worker's labor. And this has to do with something called value added, which is very important as we investigate the idea of free and fair trade. So to sum up, there was a fellow named Warren Buffett who once said that price is what you pay, but value is what you get. That has to do with consumer surplus. And now, related to value is the whole idea of value added production. You take any commodity, here we're talking about fair trade, and fair trade deals with agricultural commodities like coffee. So I will use coffee in my illustrations here. Coffee starts off as a cherry. There's a little cherry, a red cherry that is picked from a tree, maybe in Ethiopia. And the outside has a fleshy membrane to it that has to be removed. So the first step in the production of coffee is to remove this fleshy outside from the cherry. And once that is removed, we have a husk that is left over. And inside the husk is the green coffee bean. So the husk is dried, and then it is cracked open, and the coffee bean is removed. So we see these very simple stages of production to add value to the production of coffee. Then after that, of course, there's exporting, there may be grading, roasting, blending, and finally then you have your great cup of coffee coming to you and a nice aroma at somewhere at your favorite coffee shop down the street. So we see that coffee goes from a very humble coffee cherry and is added value through the contribution of labor and capital to the final point when you enjoy the retail cup of coffee. That's the idea of value added production. All right, now at this time, let's focus on fair trade. Fair trade is defined as trade in which fair prices are paid to producers in developing nations. So we're focusing in fair trade on poorer countries such as Burkina Faso, Ghana, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Honduras, Nepal, places like that, that have very poor small-scale, smallholder farmers producing. And the fair price, by definition, is higher than the free market equilibrium price that we find in our microeconomic analysis. However, the fair price is not well defined. Nobody can point and say, this is the fair price for coffee or for cocoa, for instance. And the fair trade movement started with a goal of helping producers in these developing countries improve their economic situation. And that happens by receiving higher prices for their products, for their produce, and also by improving their working conditions. And most importantly, that involves securing property rights for smallholder farmers, and also improving their legal standing in their legal system, which many times is quite murky or unknown in contrast to what we have here in the United States. So fair trade markets include coffee, cocoa, cotton in West Africa. There is flowers from places like Zambia. We have vegetables as well, and handicrafts. Now, fair trade as a movement has three core beliefs. First of all, producers have the power to express unity with consumers. So we see then that there is a relationship that is formed between the producer and the consumer in fair trade. Under normal trade relations, you don't know who the producer of the coffee bean is. You don't know where your chocolate is coming from. But under fair trade, they do emphasize that focus. Also, the second belief is that current world trade practices promote the unequal distribution of wealth between nations. So this goes back to our idea of value-added production. Here, the farmer in Ethiopia grows coffee trees and harvests the coffee cherries, but at that point, the cherries don't have much value in themselves. Additional labor and capital have to be applied to the cherries to transform them into a great cup of coffee. And that is something that fair trade is seeking to address. And the third belief is that buying products from producers in developing nations at a fair trade price is more efficient way of helping and assisting developing nations than giving charitable handouts. That is to say, if I give a handout of money, then I might make the person dependent. But if I can trade with them, I have something to receive from them in exchange for a payment. And that will enhance their opportunity to grow their production of that good. Let's take a look now at the history of the fair trade movement. The fair trade movement began in the 1940s with the Mennonite Central Committee, and they first began to export handicrafts to America and Canada and Europe. And then in the 60s, a slogan came into usage having to do with trade and not aid, going back to the idea that it is better to trade in exchange payment than simply to give handouts to people. In the 80s, the market for handicrafts became saturated, and so attention then moved to agricultural commodities. The producers of many of these commodities were relatively poor smallholder farmers. And then in 1988, the fair trade movement began to certify producers that were qualified to be called fair trade producers. And this provided a degree of information to consumers who wished to do something right and help people in need. And so that's when the fair trade movement really picked up a lot of steam. Consumers were willing wanting to do something good for producers who are in a hard situation. And they did that by adding value or information. We call this attributes. We added attributes to these commodities. So instead of just having a bag of coffee beans now, we could say, here, this is a bag of coffee from Rwanda. And here is some information about the growers of this coffee from Rwanda. And they followed this procedure in their cultivation of the coffee. And the shipping and handling procedures is known as well. And so there's a great deal of information in a story behind this bag of fair trade coffee from Rwanda. And so that is what distinguishes fair trade from free trade. There is now what we call a differentiation between the simple commodity, a bag of coffee, and fair trade coffee from Rwanda, from a particular village that we can know about. And that distinguishes and sets that coffee from Rwanda apart from all the other coffee harvested around the world. Let's take a look from an economic point of view of what's going on with fair trade markets. So the economic analysis tells us, first of all, that fair trade prices are equal to the market price plus a fair trade premium that is intended to go to the welfare of the fair trade producers. A higher price, in fact, will stimulate more production. That's simple economics. We see that if you raise the price of something, that will stimulate producers to bring more supply to the market, but also it acts as a disincentive to consumers. Consumers will not want to buy so much at such a high price. And so you may end up with a fall in consumption as a result of higher prices. And the purpose of these higher prices, remember, is to increase the income to these participating farmers and their cooperatives. Now, let's go ahead and discuss what happens when we find that free trade and fair trade are in conflict. Well, what's going on there? Well, we know that from microeconomics that these principles determine the market clearing equilibrium price for, in this case, coffee. That's what we call the free market price. Now, we must be careful in how we define the product and how we define the market. We have fair trade labeling and certification will differentiate and set apart fair trade coffee from coffee which is considered a commodity. A commodity good is identical to every other good in that category. So one coffee bean is just like another at the commodity level, but fair trade adds the distinguishing attributes which make fair trade coffee a different good from normal coffee as a commodity. So now we have actually two markets. Two markets exist, one for commodity coffee and one for fair trade coffee. And this is important because consumers will look at that and make a decision of what to produce. Consumers, in fact, they want low prices. The suppliers want high prices. That is a conflict. That happens in every market in the world where there is a divergence of interest between consumers and producers. And they meet then in a at a compromise at the equilibrium price. Now, that's how the conflict is resolved in market operations. Now, also, government policy has a role as well. Governments will seek to determine the nature of intervention, and there are a few different types of intervention. Governments may decide to, on the exporting side, they may set up what is called a licensing board. That means that farmers of cocoa, for instance, in Ghana, may have no choice but to sell all of their cocoa beans to the Ghanaian licensing board. And with that setup, sometimes the government may provide or offer a lower than market price to the farmers, but they have no choice to sell elsewhere because they are legally obligated to sell to the licensing board. Now, on the importing country side, we have governments seeking to further the economic development of foreign nations, and they may do that through encouraging or enhancing fair trade practices. You see this greatly in Europe and somewhat here in the United States and Canada. In some countries, the government policy may be more mercantile in nature. They may want to get the most rock bottom price possible, no matter what, and that would be possible as well. So the role of government will vary according to their interest. Sometimes governments operate out of foreign policy objectives that are not directly tied to the commodity. Now, there also is a conflict between goods. See, each consumer has a wallet full of money, and it's like a vote. You vote with your money to buy things. You vote to buy coffee or ice cream or a bicycle or whatever the case may be. So all these goods are competing for your consumer dollar. And the same thing is true with fair trade coffee and regular commodity coffee. That's the nature of markets. And so we have to keep in mind that this market actually is composed of two segments. We have, again, the commodity market for coffee, trading at the free market price, and also we have the fair trade coffee trading at a higher price. The fair trade coffee is composed of the attributes of information and the story behind the production and the certification behind fair trade. So keep that in mind, that there are two markets operating in this discussion. Now you may ask, well, which market is better? That's a question for consumers to decide in their own subjective valuation. All right, one last point is that governments may also decide to intervene in a way that they think consumers would want them to intervene. So they may take action and decide for consumers what they think is best in terms of fair trade or commodity-based markets. All right, well, this brings our discussion to a close, and I look forward to our question and answer time after this. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Larson.
Thank you, you're welcome.
I'm gonna pop on here for our giveaway now. All right, well, I am Natalia Rosa, and I'm Director of Education and Marketing for NCFCA, and I'll be hosting the giveaway this evening on behalf of our sponsors, the University of Northwestern. As I mentioned in the beginning, the University of Northwestern is offering a free t-shirt giveaway and, or 2 t-shirts, excuse me, and then 1 sweatshirt. So the winner of our sweatshirt giveaway based on engagement most definitely goes to the Woodward family. You submitted a lot of questions throughout this discussion, and so I'm really excited to see Dr. Larson's responses to those questions in just a minute. There's going to be some great conversation based on those, I'm sure, as well as the other questions that were submitted. So Woodward family, or whoever the representative is, if you could go ahead and drop your email address directly to the panelists into the chat, we will connect afterwards to make sure that you can get your free t-shirt, excuse me, sweatshirt. And then the 2 t-shirt winners are going to be pulling up the random selection here. All right, Brennan Schlitz. So again, Brennan, if you could drop your email address into the chat function, we'll make sure that you get your free t-shirt. And then the second winner of the free t-shirt is going to be Christine Peters. Christine Peters. So congratulations to all of you. Again, if I called your name, if you could drop your email address into the chat function here, it'll only go directly to the panelists, and I will connect with you afterwards to make sure that you receive your gift. So with that, I just want to give you a couple of brief reminders as Dr. Larson and Dr. Paul get ready to join us once again and review your questions. Remember, as I'm going over these reminders, that you can go ahead and submit questions. It's not too late using the Q&A function, and we will get to those in just a minute. So the first thing that I want to remind you of is that we have the NCFCA Comprehensive Guide to Policy Debate. It's available on the website if you're looking for a resource to support your students in policy debate this fall. I know that this is the Lincoln Douglas Value Debate webinar, but perhaps you have another student participating in that event and you're looking for some resources. We'll be dropping the link for accessing that resource into the chat, and I encourage you to take a look and see if that could be of use to you for this season. And also dropping into the chat right now is the link to registration for our upcoming Team Policy Debate webinar, which is going to be with Dr. Jonathan Loopstra this Thursday, August 30th at 6 p.m. Central. So if you're a coach, if you have students or friends participating in Team Policy Debate, send the word along, send them this link so they can prepare for the team policy resolution. Next, want to let you know, remember that the Lincoln Douglas curriculum is coming this summer of 2019. So keep your eyes open for that, and it will be available for next season. And the speech curriculum is also available if you're looking for support in your speech training this season. So with that, I'm going to get ready to turn this back over to Dr. Paul and Dr. Larson, if you both want to join us back on screen, and we'll launch into our exciting question and answer time. I know Dr. Paul and I, our fingers were flying back here trying to keep track of all of the questions that were pouring in. So I anticipate this is going to be a great conversation.
Thank you, Natalia. Yes. Wow, that is a lot of questions coming your way, Dr. Larson. I was trying frantically to try and group them together in some kind of an order that might help address a lot of the questions. I do want to start off, though, first of all, to just thank you all for your questions. Those are excellent, excellent questions. But I also want to say, I'm sorry. I really don't think we have the time to cover all your questions, and that is unfortunate. We're going to try and get to a lot of them, but if I don't get to your particular question, yeah, I apologize in advance. It's just, we just don't have that much time to cover this. So with that said, Dr. Larson, let me, I'm going to sort of give you a category and kind of throw some questions that fit under that category at you. And if you could sort of get the, sort of get the gist of what all those questions are trying to get at and address those, that would be very helpful.
Okay.
All right. So I know we had questions, we had some questions on the free trade side. I'm going to wait till later to get to those. I'm going to start off on the fair trade side. And these are some of the questions that were asked related to that. I'm just going to list off several questions. All right. So what can make trade unfair? Does fair trade harm the free market? If so, how? Do more countries benefit from free trade or fair trade? What countries benefit most from fair trade? Can free trade ever be considered fair? Would you say fair trade is the more godly or biblical of the two policies? To get fair trade certification costs a lot of money. So is that not another cost which goes straight to the producer, thus not assisting a third world economy get out of that situation? In many cases, fair trade seems to claim the moral high ground over free trade. Are there some situations where this claim is incorrect? Fair trade and free trade are technically set on the same principles of most net benefit. Is that correct? Or is fair trade only meant to help countries? I'm going to pause there. And
Okay.
I know there are a few things there if you want to cover those.
Well, thank you, Robbie. Those are great questions. I think that you see that there's a discussion about the nature of free trade, and does that overlap, or how does that relate to fair trade? Fair trade does claim the higher ground, the higher moral ground, compared to free trade, but that doesn't mean that free trade is necessarily not fair trade. So you have to carefully define what you mean by fair trade. We have a good idea of what we mean by free trade, and let's start with free trade. Free trade, by definition, cannot, I would say, cannot be unfair, because it is voluntary and private between two voluntary parties. Now, something that we did not talk about is that our actual economic relations is not purely free trade. Free trade is almost like an ideal. And we really exist in more of a mixed economy with government intervention, with various distortions in the market, with various market participants abusing power or using what we call market power. So it's not as clear cut as you would think. So free trade in principle is fair, but there are certainly opportunities to remove the fairness from free trade. Now, free trade, or let's go to fair trade. Fair trade does claim the higher moral ground because it is adding that personal attribution that we talked about. There's a personal connection and this additional information and attributes that we know as consumers about the prospects and the history and the production methods of the fair trade farmers. So when they talk about claiming the high moral ground, they're really talking about paying a premium to know more about the conditions of the producers in developing countries. I hope that helps. Oh, well, I don't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah. Now. Yeah. I think that was really great. I know there were sort of nuances there in those questions that, again, would take a while to answer, but I think you got the basic gist of it. I'm gonna switch tracks and move to a few questions that are related to the government as the actor. This one question is a slightly longer one, but I think it's a good one, and then I have a few more follow-up there. Do governments have the duty or obligation to their citizens to look out for their optimal well-being? Or do they only have the duty or obligation to make sure the citizens have the opportunity to achieve their optimal well-being? Slightly different track, but related to government. Was the fair trade movement started by the government? And is fair trade limited to the fair trade movement?
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The first question, government, the question is government responsible for the optimal well-being of economic agents, or is government simply there to create the conditions for agents, I think, to go ahead and do what they believe would be most optimal? That depends on your theory or your view of the role of government. On one hand, a more limited government point of view would say that government is responsible just for creating the conditions for people to create their own well-being. A more active, intervening, interventional type government theory would say that no, government is responsible for creating wellness for people directly. So those depend on your philosophy of government. The second question deals with how did fair trade start, I believe. Fair trade was not started by government. It was started by nonprofit organizations such as the Mennonite Central Committee, and other groups began to work on a nonprofit or voluntary basis in the early years. Later on, governments picked this up and included fair trade, I think, as a tool of foreign policy or economic assistance in the later years. And the third question was, let's see here. What was the third question again?
Is fair trade limited to the fair trade movement?
It doesn't have to be limited to the fair trade movement. No, it's a philosophy that that believes that producers low on the value chain in the stages of production ought to receive more of that producer surplus than they are currently receiving. So there is no reason why we would have to limit fair trade to only farmers in developing countries.
Okay, thank you. A couple of other questions sort of along the same lines. Is fair trade only limited to developing countries? And how can fair trade be enforced besides the government placing restrictions on trade?
Fair trade does not have to be limited to developing countries. There are many opportunities to apply the same principles in markets here in the developed world. That would be no problem. Again, you need a divergence of well-being and wealth, I think, to make the opportunities for fair trade to become visible. And the second question, does fair trade have to be enforced by government? Not necessarily. Fair trade, there's no reason why fair trade could not be a voluntary agreement among cooperating parties. So I may get together with my friends and desire to buy coffee from Honduras, and that can all be a private and voluntary exchange, an agreement with the growers of coffee in Honduras. The fair trade certification has been run by nonprofit agencies, which kind of verify or confirm the fair trade status. So there is no necessarily no necessary need for government enforcement.
Okay, great. Is fair trade socialism?
Fair trade is not socialism. Socialism is where the government controls the factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. Fair trade is simply the willingness and ability to pay a premium to know, in essence, that premium is going to go to the welfare of the producers of the thing that you're buying. So it is not socialism. Fair trade is simply a market in these additional attributes which make your coffee consumption more meaningful. I can buy fair trade coffee knowing that that additional premium that I pay is going to help these farmers improve their livelihood. It doesn't disqualify free markets. It's simply a willingness to pay a premium above and beyond the market price.
Okay, thank you. In your opinion, is free trade or fair trade better for the U.S. economy?
That would depend upon the preferences of consumers in the U.S. You can't answer that question without knowing what consumers prefer. Years ago, people just bought coffee and cocoa from wherever, and they had no idea where it came from, the story behind it. But nowadays, people are much more interested in knowing the story behind their coffee or behind their green beans or their cotton from West Africa. So if consumers are interested in knowing that and willing and able to pay the premium to secure that information, then that's a gain for America. Other consumers may not care so much about that, and that's okay too. So neither fair trade is not a loss to the economy.
Yeah, so following up, I'm looking at a late question that came in. I think it's very sort of relevant to this. And Ken says, why should governments not receiving the fair trade benefits value it? As in, why should America value it if it doesn't help American citizens aside from a moral boost?
Why should governments be involved in fair trade?
Well, why should the government, like the US government, for instance, even value it if they don't receive the benefits?
Yes, that's right. The benefit accrues to the consumer in terms of this moral feeling of knowing about the history of their coffee and about the growers. The government would view fair trade as perhaps a foreign policy objective. So instead of having a USAID ship a lot of corn or rice or sugar overseas, they could instead start to buy these things from local producers under a fair trade framework. And that would realize maybe their foreign policy or development aims in a more healthy manner. So that would be possible. The government would have its own separate reasons for participating or encouraging fair trade.
Okay, yes. How long, let me use another one. Sorry, give me just 1 second. I was caught up in your answer. It was so good. I wasn't paying attention to the questions. I think you answered some of these. All right, so you talked about moving a little bit to the free trade side. When you talked about absolute advantage, isn't that the invisible hand theory on a larger scale?
absolute advantage is really not that strongly related to the invisible hand. It has to do about efficiency. Who is the most efficient or cost-effective producer? And Ricardo is arguing that it's really the producer who has a lower relative cost and not the absolute cost. So a lawyer could go ahead and do his own taxes quite well, but his time is very expensive. So it makes it worthwhile for the lawyer to go ahead and hire a tax accountant to do his taxes, because the tax accountant's time is not so greatly valued as a lawyer's.
Okay, thank you. Just a brief note here. Those of you that we're scheduled to stop at right now at 8 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Larson has graciously agreed to spend a few more minutes. So if y'all need to take off, that's fine, obviously, but he is willing to stay on. So we're gonna take a few more of his minutes and answer some more questions. So thank you for doing that, Dr. Larson.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing on, what can make trade unfair?
What can make trade unfair? Trade could become unfair when people violate the provisions of acting in a voluntary way. So if I'm trading and I use coercion to get you to do something, to trade with me, that would be unfair. If I use threats, or if I use some kind of blackmail or something like that, if I use any of those tools, then the trade is no longer free trade, and it's no longer certainly not fair trade because of that coercion.
Okay. So does fair trade harm the free market? If so, how?
No, fair trade, I believe, does not harm the free market. It does have an indirect effect on the free market. Fair trade by itself, again, is simply somebody willing to pay a premium to know the attributes behind the commodity. Now, there is a secondary effect that is not so keenly observed. When you raise the price of something, you're going to increase the supply. And so to many people, fair trade coffee, say, and free trade coffee look the same. And so a fair trade price premium will increase the production of coffee, and it may raise the price of the commodity coffee as well. And the secondary effect then would be to stimulate additional production, which would have the ultimate effect of lowering prices. So that'd be kind of a secondary effect that is not so visible.
Yeah, so sort of continuing on that same vein, can you sort of talk a little bit more about the interplay of these ideas of philosophies and as related to developing versus non-developed or developed countries? So it seems like, you know, the examples and things that we see and what you've talked about seems to impact developing countries. There's a question there, Uganda, Rwanda, etc. But what does that mean for developed countries like the US, South Korea, especially? Just the interplay of fair trade and free trade and developing versus developed countries.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. The nature of the problem or of the issue is the same, but maybe on a different scale. Free trade and fair trade act similarly. Let's see. In developing countries, you have producers who are starting with very, very low value added commodities like coffee cherries. And so their contribution to the whole retail coffee product is very, very small as a percentage. And that's the problem that fair trade is trying to fix by paying these premiums. However, you could certainly have the same problems or applications in developed countries, it'd be no problem. You can imagine here in America, there is a wheat farmer. You know, the wheat farmer and the corn farmers, they grow wheat and corn, and the value they add is, I don't know what the percentage would be, but after the harvest, there's the transport, there's the drying, cleaning, processing, and eventually you end up with spaghetti or Cheerios at the retail level. And so that would certainly apply, say, with rice in South Korea. Rice farmers, they grow rice, but then there are many stages of production that are added after that initial grower stage of production. And so the problem is, another way to look at it is how to add, or how can these producers capture more of these stages of production and capture more of that producer surplus by going up the supply chain.
Okay. In your opinion, what is at the heart of the clash between free trade and fair trade?
The heart of the clash, in my opinion, is this idea of value-added production. People observe that here a coffee farmer in Ethiopia, grows the coffee beans, and they sell them to a person who takes the husk off to reveal the green coffee bean. And so the farmer growing the coffee cherries receives very little value because the coffee cherry still needs to go through several stages of processing to become coffee in a retail establishment. That is the observation that people see, and they think and they're trying to fix that through fair trade by paying a premium in fair trade prices to the farmer who grows the coffee cherries.
Okay. Would you say that free trade means absolutely no government regulation of trade whatsoever?
In the ideal form, yes. Free trade would mean no government intervention outside of the government enforcing the property rights and respecting those property rights. But in the real world, free trade does not totally exist. You won't find a country that has pure free trade. Neither will you find a country that has, for instance, pure communism. Even in North Korea, there are small markets where people buy and sell things under the cover of their houses and so on. So it's more, free trade is more of an ideal in the real world.
Maybe the last question here, Dr. Larson. What principles might a Christian who generally believes in free trade find in common with advocates of fair trade? How might one defend the fair trade position?
That's a great question. I would go back to the argument about looking for the interests of others that Paul talks about in Philippians. The free trade is morally defensible. There's nothing wrong with that. Two parties entering a voluntary agreement, and they both walk away with something more valuable. Otherwise, they would not enter that exchange. Okay. But sometimes the driving, it might be possible to drive too hard of a bargain. And this is more in personal markets where you see a person, say, in a city market or something like that. Commodity markets are more impersonal, but there is room for a person to show a bit of grace and to add a bonus to their payment or their exchange. For instance, oftentimes you see in developing markets, when you go to buy a commodity like corn, the seller at the market will be very careful to add more than was contracted for. So if you buy a kilo of corn they're going to give you maybe a little bit extra on top of that, even though they're not obligated to pay you or to give you more than 1 kilo of corn. But that is a way of showing a bit of grace on the part of a Christian, and that would be also a good way to maintain the good favor of your trading partners. If you always drive a very legal standard in your trading, down to the very last gram, then you are following your obligations, but you may not be making long-term trading friendships either.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay. If I could, one quick one.
Sure.
Someone's asked this quite a few times. When did the fair trade movement begin? I think you addressed this earlier, but if you could just.
Well, it began with the Mennonite Central Committee in roughly the 1940s and 50s.
1940s.
Yeah.
Okay. And someone else would like for you to repeat the 3 fair trade beliefs that you mentioned, if you could.
Yes. The 3 core beliefs of fair trade are the following. The first belief is that producers have the power to express unity with consumers. So producers have the power or the opportunity to express a unity or this relationship with consumers on the other side of the world. The second belief is that current worldwide trade practices promote the unequal distribution of wealth between nations. Now, underneath this refers to the sharing of that producer surplus across the different stages of production. And thirdly, buying products from producers in developing nations at a fair trade price is a more efficient way of conducting aid than simply giving charitable handouts.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Larson. I think that was perfect. We really, really appreciate your time and the knowledge that you shared with us. And thank you to everybody that participated. You all had such fabulous questions. I really am sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but hope this webinar has been helpful, and we look forward to seeing all of you soon at another webinar. With that, I'll hand it over to Natalia. Thank you again, Dr. Larson, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Paul and Dr. Larson. That was wonderful. I know there were definitely so many questions and just comments in the chat thanking you, Dr. Larson and Dr. Paul, for your time. We really do appreciate it. So on that note, thank you all for joining us for the 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar series. If you have questions, as always, remember that you can email our office, and the address for that is office@ncfca.org. We hope this has been helpful for you in preparation for the 2018 to 2019 season, and we're so grateful to have you join the NCFCA family this year and look forward to an incredible year of communicating truth and transforming culture together. So God bless. Y'all have a wonderful evening.